This is the Rex alumni reunion of August 2020. Like an alumni club, right?
Where's my sherry?
Yeah, good point. Good point. So my econometrics professor at Irvine was Jack Johnston, who had written one of the good textbooks in econometrics. And in his file cabinet in his office at Irvine, he had some Tio Pepe, which he would pull out now and then. So that's as close as I've never met an Oxford Don or anything like that, you know. So that's as close as I've come to that look and feel.
Okay. It's a little early in the day.
Exactly. Peter was just describing a school he's standing up called the Scaffold, which has a pun in Dutch because the word is stelling. And scaffold also means a thesis or a proposition. So as he describes it, it's a transdisciplinary school with a nonconformist tribe to help them execute their works.
Wow. A school, like as in a place where people will come on it every day to learn with each other?
No, it's a long format. So the idea is that we create like a 6-month expedition with a number of sessions during that expedition, like 2 or 3 per month. Some online, some offline. We have found some really great physical locations here in Flanders that we can start looking at. Like there is something called the Winter Circus, which is an old stone building that was used in the 50s, I think, as a circus with elephants and circus. So it was not taken care of. So very recently, the city of Ghent refurbished it completely. So it has now been made available at what they call casco, which means that they still have to paint inside and to set up the rooms inside, but the structure is completely finished. And so they kept the roughness of the walls, and it has a huge central plaza with a fantastic roof on it, with light coming from tops. So it's going to be used as a new hotspot for Ghent to bring together artists, entrepreneurs, and engineers. And our friend Peter Hinson, that Jerry knows, is one of the members of the consortium that has won the exploitation bid for that circus. So they are in the last phase. There's only one candidate, so it's a little bit a procedural Kafka story, but so the final chosen partner, there's only one, will get an exploitation license for 75 years of that building.
Wow.
But they have to, so the building itself is a fantastic place to bring people together. So if we would think about that school, some sessions would happen in the building, some intermediary sessions would happen online, all highly facilitated with artists and so on. I'm taking too much space here. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's a cool project. So Peter's describing a building that's been refurbished in Ghent, turned into a performance, art, education, other sorts of space where I guess people are bidding on using the space for a pretty long term, which is cool. And he's looking at standing up a new century school called the Scaffold, which we were just talking about. So it's quite cool. How's everybody? Nice to see everyone. Jamea, are we getting closer to doom?
Oh, always. Today is the best day we have left.
Wow. You know what? You should propagate an affirmation as a meme. Today is the best day of the rest of my life. I know that because we're heading off the cliff.
No, I was thinking last night that Do any of you remember Fitzmas? Fitzmas? Fitzmas. Okay, so it's back in the George W. Bush administration. The guy named Fitzgerald, whatever it was. So some prosecutor was going after the some folks, the Bush administration, and there was so much crap online from ostensibly liberal quarters about seeing Karl Rove frog march out of the White House, and just the day that this guy was supposed to put out his report was referred to by a lot of liberal political sites as Fitzmas. And of course, nothing came of it. It was just a bust. And I saw the same kind of hype around Mueller's report. Now there was a bit more there with the Mueller report, but not much.
Just a bit, really.
And I mean, in terms of impact, not much more of an impact. And a lot of noise, a lot of potential that really went nowhere. And so I'm beginning to suspect that we're going to see the same kind of thing around all of the January 6th investigations and the going into raiding Mar-a-Lago, all that stuff. Is going to be a lot of noise, a lot of potential disruption, and nothing comes of it. Except this time, this is going to be seen as, think of the kind of reaction that a lot of the folks in the Trump administration had after the Mueller report came out. Basically, hey, we were exonerated. It was all a nothing murder and just nothing to worry about. We were completely right. So imagine that same kind of reaction cranked up 100-fold after Trump gets off from all of this. That nothing actually sticks, and nothing actually is done to hold him accountable and hold his administration accountable. I think that feels like the most likely outcome in this. So of the three potential outcomes of them not doing anything would be a really bad idea. Them doing something and getting him actually convicted on things, all of the investigations being entirely successful would have led to enormous amounts of violence in the short term, probably be better in the long term. But the worst possible outcome would be going after him to trigger a whole bunch of violence and then not get anything out of it. And I think that's where we're headed. So that's my happy thought of the day.
That was so uplifting. Mika, I cannot help but turn to you and say, is the noose actually closing around his neck or not?
Well, I think I have a different opinion than Jemay. I think what the Justice Department and the FBI just did is a pretty big deal. And once you take that step, it will likely follow with more serious legal action. And I do think the air is seeping out of Republican-based support for Trump. That doesn't mean that Trumpism is also in decline. I don't think that at all. But on balance, I wrote about this on Monday. During the Watergate scandal, people didn't know how it was going to end while it was going on, right? Obviously. There was a great deal of morbid fascination, I quoted from Slow Burn, this really great podcast about, various scandals. But if you haven't listened to the first series, which is all about Watergate, it's great. It actually inspired the Martha Mitchell show that was just up on, I forget, Netflix or something, Gaslit. But he quotes Dick Cavett and then Gore Vidal talking about how people just needed their Watergate fix every day. They, would rush out to buy the morning paper to find out what had just happened. We didn't have instantaneous communication the way we do now, but no one knew how it was going to end. So I just feel like, we're in that sort of all kinds of possible paths can flow from this moment. We just don't know, but it is a big deal. And I would just, it's funny that that's where you went, because I've been thinking that the big news triggered by Joni Mitchell, of course, coming back and being able to perform was Joe Manchin deciding to greenlight a pretty big investment across a whole bunch of things that he'd been blocking. Now, I know it's not everything we wanted, but it's a heck of a lot more than we thought we were going to get 2 weeks ago. So
well, the Green New Deal was gigantic, like included a whole series of provisions that would have changed society dramatically forever. This is big. This is really pretty huge.
Right.
Although mixed here and there, but big.
Well, I would just say that we on the sort of center left side of the spectrum seem to be really, really good at deflating ourselves with no help from the other side.
This is the unassisted, unforced errors.
Or just, always seeing, what isn't happening rather than what is. And arguably the acceleration of, the shift to electrification seems pretty good to me. Jemay, you're way more of an expert. But I just think that, compared to what we thought where we were stuck this winter, where everything was blocked and nothing was going to be done, and all we had was people screaming about the end of the world and nothing changing. At least now we have a story that, well, actually, no, Democrats used somehow, with only 50 votes, have managed to do some substantial investment, enough that, the experts seem to say, well, America is doing a lot. Is it doing everything? Could it do more? Yes, of course. But you don't encourage people by hitting them over the head and telling them how awful and what failures they are, it seems to me.
No, and I would agree with that. I think that there is space between, America is doing a lot and America is doing everything. I think there is, and somewhere in that space is America is doing enough.
Yeah.
And we're not close to that. In part because of little things like the requirement to have more investment in offshore drilling. And I can't remember whether there's actually coal investment, but definitely the offshore drilling investment is required as part of it. Some of it was some of it is political in an unrelated to, not related to climate way. At this point, there are 0 electric cars sold in the U.S. that meet the criteria for the tax refund, tax rebate, because there is a limit on how much of the components can be produced in China. And all electric cars, mostly because of the batteries and the battery material, currently sold in the US exceed that amount. So
luckily, Elon Musk is going to fix the battery problem for us, so we'll be good there.
Yeah. By the way, just as an aside, and just to explain a little bit of the cynicism, it's now been revealed that in conversation that Musk had with his biographer, that the reason he was pushing Hyperloop is he never expected it to do anything, but he wanted to throw it in the way of the high-speed rail in California. He wanted to
derail high-speed rail.
Exactly. And you can have the pun. But in terms of his intent with that, it was purely to undermine that alternative mode of travel.
Yeah.
And so it's hard not to be cynical in that kind of environment.
It's hard not to be cynical in today's environment, period. I mean, like, takes an effort.
So
Yeah.
you are right, Mika, that this was a big deal.
Yeah.
I think my own reaction is that I really wish it was more. I couldn't expect it to be more given current politics. What I'm afraid of, and I think what a lot of people in the climate world are afraid of, is that this is seen as being, okay, we've done it. Now we don't have to worry about, we don't have to spend any more money on it. We don't have to deal with it anymore.
Oh, I don't think that's
at the DC level. At the DC level,
the DC people are always afraid of their own shadow, afraid of jumping on opportunities, because who knows what the polls will actually say. It's awful. We're going to have more impetus as we continue to see, more climate degradation, more people suffering, and more pressure as a result. So it's, all I'd ask you is, does the bill do enough in your mind to create more positive incentives for the marketplace to jump
yes.
further?
Yeah, if you set cars aside because of the whole weirdness about the China stuff, there's some really good incentives around home refits, and in particular, some good support for heat pump HVAC, heat pump water heaters, and those. Actually, we're looking at replacing our water heater with a heat pump based system because of the support, the financial support for doing so, because they're more expensive, but the financial support for doing so is improving. And I have to be careful with myself. I have to caution myself that because I have this framework in my head of it will get worse before it gets better. I'm a long-term optimist, short-term pessimist kind of framing. It's too easy to forget it gets better long-term optimist part of that equation. It's too easy to get caught in it'll get worse first, or I'm a short-term pessimist first. So your response to what I had to say is actually a nice little kick in the knee about not letting myself get too caught up in, ironically enough, short-term thinking.
The irony.
Short-term for me, 10 to 20 years, short-term.
Okay.
Anyone else have a thesis or a theory or a hope around these issues?
Jerry, could you just catch me up? What issues are we talking about?
Yeah, the angry tangle of twine that is our politics and the earth in collapse and all those kinds of things.
Okay.
And the passage of the recent bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, and its consequences. And then before that, a little bit about whether the noose is closing around Trump's neck or whether this is going to be another Mueller report or a Fitzmas, as Janae was reminding us from way back when. Yeah. So nobody's got a strong feeling about where this goes or a sense of some other thread or force that's going through here. I'm really intrigued by the red tide maybe shifting entirely. That there was the conventional wisdom a month ago was that conservatives were going to swamp Democrats during the 2022 midterms, and that is now, I think, pretty up in the air. And the local competitions, as we see the primaries go and all that, are going actually reasonably well. So, and then and then the last 2 weeks have been pretty phenomenal for progressive attitudes between Kansas, striking down hard a move to remove abortion from the Kansas Constitution. I think that's right. To a whole series of other kinds of things. One of the things, Kelly, that really angers me or strikes me is that so many of the states with trigger laws, now that Roe is out of their way, the laws they're passing are draconian. They are extreme. They are way the hell out on the far right. And I'm like, how did that happen? How did they preload a whole series of crazy ass laws that are going to hurt people actively who are alive, that are endangering, like, and it opens so many routes for contesting the laws. It's like, you know, there's lots of avenues, including Judaism, you know, including freedom of religion as an avenue for attacking Dobbs. I don't know, it seems crazy to me. So I'm sort of starting to see that conservatism is going to possibly, this is just wishful thinking, but drown in its own extremism as the positions get more extreme, more and more people will, and you know, people undecideds and indeterminates and independents will fall away from the extremist wing and say, hey, that's not what I want.
I might just say, I saw some chat about Kansas, is that I read Kansas more as a libertarian instinct, right, than a democratic instinct. End of thought.
I saw some tweets about how the advertising to but against the amendment was around don't make government bigger, as much as it was around preserve bodily autonomy or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a problem with this because
No, it's just an observation. All right. Some people are interpreting it as being a democratic instinct in Kansas. And I am saying, no, it's a libertarian instinct. And, you know, having been born in the hospital in Kansas City, the whole notion of strong women, right, pioneer, you know, make it on your own is very strong there. So this was, you know, this particular, would you like to vote on taking, you know, your own ability to make your own choices away from you? No, I don't think so.
Which side of the border were you born in?
I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, but my family, when we moved back from Tulsa after the adoption, we lived in Leawood, Kansas. So we dotted the plains through that, then on to Memphis, on to Chicago, and then eventually New Canaan, Connecticut.
There's a whole really interesting narrative. I'm forgetting which book this came from. It might have been Cadillac Desert, likely is Cadillac Desert, about water in the West and how the railroads basically marketed the hell out of territories in the West that they completely knew nobody could farm. Like these were high plains, maybe good for grazing. Some of it might actually sustain some cows. Most of it was not going to be good for kind of anything. And they were like pimping this out because they needed to sell land to make, you know, they could make a whole they could flip a buck by selling these plots. Then large land speculators waited for those farmers to go bust, bought up their plots for nothing and created large holdings, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know how else it plays out, but there's this whole kind of fiendish misstatement of what it was actually like to be out West and try to make a living.
So, Jerry, I'll just condense this into short. My father and his sister grew up as the son and daughter of a track foreman for the Santa Fe Railroad.
Oh, wow.
And they were building the second line between Texas and Chicago. And as the line moved forward, they were actually housed in a boxcar that was converted into the track foreman's residence.
Amazing.
And every 2 or 3 weeks, as the track moved forward, they changed schools. They went from
every 2 or 3 weeks a new school. Wow.
Yeah. So when we moved, my dad said, no sweat, you know, because he was moving all the time when he was a kid, right? And made friends very easily. You know, it was all, you know, part of, hey, you know, change is good, right? Let's go. He skipped 2 grades when he was in grade school because he could hear all the lessons. They were all being taught kind of simultaneously. So it's kind of like, oh, there's more to it, but
I love
it's
that,
very,
Kevin.
it's a very interesting backstory to
You-
why
you
he
tell-
ended up the way he was.
Do you tell this story often in consulting engagements or speeches or things like that? Because it's a really lovely story about adapting to change or seeing change as a good.
Yeah, I mean, when it's appropriate. I mean, it's actually one of the when I worked for the same company that my father worked for, I hid those stories because I didn't want to, ride on his coattails, right? Inside of a large organization. I wanted to, make my own way. But, since then, I've told those stories much more often.
Love that. What else is on anybody's mind?
Rewilding.
Rewilding of the government?
No, actually, there is. I just
Thanks for
posted
laughing,
the
Dave.
link. A proposal in the academic journal Bioscience to link up 11 large natural reserves to
Mhm.
form a multi-state wildlife corridor. It's a huge chunk of land, and then reintroduce the gray wolf and the North American beaver as keystone species. Basically, the potential for the positive transformation of the physical environment that would come from this. The main downside is it would mean removing some grazing rights that they very quickly argue need to be paid for, of course. But you're going to get a lot of pushback in the American West from a lot of people who see that land as being, there for the cows, not for anything else.
Yeah, I haven't seen this piece or heard of this movement, although little maybe hints of it. Is this at all connected to land back for indigenous peoples? Because one of the big problems, like when Ansel Adams wanted to photograph Yosemite, they shoved all the native tribes out of there. And there's nothing better for wildlife than humans who know how to manage it well. And so actually declaring a whole chunk to be pristine wildlife with no humans on it turns my stomach.
Why
I see
would
that
you
as I see that as a huge negative.
Okay, I'm so completely in opposition to you.
Awesome.
I
Let's
don't,
talk about it.
I don't understand why you would say that environment managed by humans is better for the diversity of species and the health of the environment than a no human environment, otherwise an otherwise untouched environment.
There's a couple reasons. Maybe this is a greater good argument. I don't know. I'm not a utilitarian, but first of all, these were all lands that were originally managed really well for a couple tens of thousands of years, or maybe just 15,000 years by Native Americans. They were doing a fine job managing the American landscape before any Europeans ever showed up. There's lots of that and plenty of history, and this is true in Australia, North and South America, all over the place. And they didn't have this notion of plots of land, et cetera. So that's one thing. Second, taking out, sort of cutting out these gigantic tracts of lands and saying nothing can happen on them. We're just going to let them go back to the wild is crazy and sort of dumb, isn't it?
Why? No, why is it crazy?
Because there's a lot of things you can do that are actually really useful and good. Sorry, but Kelly's got to go.
Are you guys getting hung up, just to ask a question, on the word management? Because I think that you're potentially using the term differently. Jerry's, I think, is thinking more along the line of stewardship, and management is more like modern, applying management techniques, right, of actively manage something, right, in Jamay's case. I only offer that as a thesis.
Where I'm getting hung up is the thought that human intervention however articulated into an ecosystem, would be
A good thing for the
superior to-
ecosystem?
a better thing for the ecosystem than in a sufficiently large space, which this looks like it would be, a lack of human intervention. The combination of space and time, physical space and enough time for systems to rebalance. In terms of the health and diversity of that particular ecosystem, I don't see why human intervention, however gussied up,
Right.
would be superior to that. And you and I've had this argument before, Jerry, about the idea that pre-European contact North America was a garden of delight and
Not a garden of
purity and innocence. It's
Never a claim
there
I'm
were
making. You are
heavily
overstating my
implied,
claim heavily there. Yeah.
implied, Jerry, and we've had this conversation before. I don't.
I want to plant in your head
I'll
the
just leave it
idea
at
that I want to plant in your head the idea that completely turning over a large swath of land to nature itself is a waste and a stupid thing for humans to do.
Yeah, it's just so that actually gives me a physical reaction to hear you say
I love that.
Jerry.
I love that. I
The
want to put that in
notion
your
that-
head.
The notion that turning it over without humans is a waste.
So
Actually, it makes me feel. It actually makes me feel a little bit nauseated.
I'm sorry about
that. Someone
I'm
that I
sorry for the
respect
nausea.
so much would say that.
Maybe the waste is the wrong word to use. And I appreciate Kevin working on vocabulary here for us because that is helpful. So there's very little land in America that is as it was before settlement, right? Like the Pacific Northwest was logged out of ponderosa pine. What grew in its place was fir and lodgepole and a couple other things, and the ecosystem is completely different. Then we have invasive species, we have all sorts of undermining of the ecology. So there's a huge deficit of all different kinds on the land that we're trying to sort of cut away. So on the one hand, humans doing the right thing gently with nature, in cooperation with nature, greatly observant of nature, could in fact accelerate the improvement of nature back to recover what it needs to recover. Otherwise, some of these invasive species are just going to take over, and well, good luck. Over a couple millennia, maybe over a couple more than millennia, it might come back to some other balance, but maybe not. So I'm saying humans knowing what they're doing, working to cooperate with nature, might in fact do the right thing over and over and over, and turn this into a better carbon capture zone, et cetera, et cetera. Tom has large machines nearby, so it is ironic.
Yes.
Are they watering the lawns? The golf lawns?
Oh, they do that every night. But right now, it's a couple of very large blowers that don't like leaves on the course.
Of course, of course. Mr. Witzel, you've been very patient.
No, I think it's a really interesting conversation, but I mean, there's two things that I wonder about. One is, I think, Jamie, that the separation of humans from the environment is a kind of a philosophical mistake. And so somehow it just reinforces that kind of engineering. Somehow there's people and there's the environment, and we shouldn't mix them kind of notion. And I haven't really figured out how to understand that, because I'm pretty separate from the environment. But I feel like there's probably an insight in there that it's just this idea that humans are different from, the environment is a bad thing. We should work on that story. And so the idea of you're preserving something from humans is kind of a bad notion in my mind. But I'm not exactly sure, in our current status, it's like maybe a better thing, but it's still a bad thing.
My understanding is that it wouldn't be barring the presence of humans, visitors and tourists and researchers and such. It is barring, at least according to my understanding of it, it would be removing the things like grazing land, farmland, cattle, lumber, whatever remains of the lumber industry in those areas, but in mostly it would mostly be getting rid of the grazing lands for livestock. In terms of management, in management in the sense of removing invasive species, the article that I saw did not cover that. It's the argument in general around rewilding is mostly to allow the diversity of the non-charismatic species, basically the insects and the rodents and the various kinds of pollinators and all of these kinds of, well, feral hogs actually that got mentioned in particular because the reintroduction of gray wolves would be really effective against the feral hogs. And and that's part of it as well. It is the reintroduction of that larger cycle, that larger circle of life.
I can hear the jungle tune,
and I haven't
jungle
read
tune
this.
in the back. Go ahead.
I haven't read the article, Jimmy, so I don't know the details. But essentially, that's what we've been doing with national parks, right? So we have a history of, I think, conservation, and the notion of conservation is, preserve the environment from the damages of people, right? But I think Jerry's right that people have been integrated into these environments kind of forever, so or at least as long as humanity can remember. And the idea of separating them out is an engineering kind of mindset, and not the way I would go. And I think there's also pretty good evidence that suggests that, at least in many cases, just leaving the land alone kind of doesn't actually lead to rapid regeneration. There's some interesting stuff around what happens if you compare land that was like once plowed but then left alone, and then how fast does it return to some kind of a natural healthy state. And it's very slow. It's hundreds of years.
Oh yeah.
And the notion that we can create topsoil, like from our childhood, right? It was like how long did you guys learn it would take to create an inch of topsoil in grad school? What's the number?
A really long time.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
1,000 years, right? That's what I remember from
at least.
right? But you can do it in a couple of years if you have human engagement. So it's the actually humans can actually dramatically increase the rate of improvement if we engage correctly. So I'm a little worried about this idea of continuing the idea that humans are always bad. Humans shouldn't engage in the environment. The environment's better without humans, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
These are complex systems.
Of course.
Yeah. My neighbor is preserved land, okay, that belongs to the North Carolina Botanical Garden. So the reason that they acquired this land was to keep it from being developed. It's essentially, when James Taylor talks about, the still and the booze that's going into Chapel Hill, this is still House Bottom. This is where the still was, okay? So it has some reasons that they want to preserve it as is. It's never been built on, other than moonshiners going down there and, harvesting some lumber, at the turn of the century and previous turn of the century. Got plenty of alcohol in town now. But, the notion is that it's a habitat for, turkeys and wolves and other things that in the more developed parts of this region, people will shoot them or they don't want them here, deer population, all that kind of stuff. So they all have, access, to this, 60 acres of land that will not be developed. And so there's a purpose to it. Do researchers go in there from the botanical garden? You bet, right? They want to see what's going on. They take measurements. They look at, the diversity of the species that are there. And we function because we live here. We're stewards of that land and make sure that people aren't going on there to do stuff that, we would prefer that they not do. So, that's just a perspective, right? And it's somewhere in between, the Jerry and the Jemay, right, views, all right? It's a hybrid, all right? Because Are they intervening? Yeah, they intervened because they wrote a big check to acquire the land, right, for it to have its current status, right? Instead of moving forward as town creeps out from the university and becoming new homes or condominiums or a shopping center or something else, because that kind of, pristine land is also a great opportunity to stick something on it. All right, end of my my observation, living next to preserved land.
I think that
a fun case is I've been watching this Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique, and they're deliberately restoring it after the Civil War. And it's kind of interesting to watch but it's a very human driven thing. I mean, the restoration is completely matched.
Well, yes. It's human driven in part because of human intervention in the past. Trying to figure out how do we return the arguments around hunting in a lot of places, for example, whether it's trophy hunting in Southern Africa or whatever kind of hunting in North America, much of it is driven by not just the desire to make money for whatever is a particular political entity that's nearby, but the need to cull deer in North America, to cull old elephants in particular in Southern Africa, because humans have decimated the top predators. And so, Ducks Unlimited is a good example of that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the better preservers of land in the US because duck hunters want to shoot ducks.
I honestly don't know if that would be forbidden in this particular proposal. I don't know if
we don't know the
is
details of the proposal. Yeah.
Right. My gut reaction to what you're saying, Jerry, it really comes from this notion that it comes from a recognition of how complex these systems are, the kinds of broader services to the planet and to human civilization that's provided by the complex diversity of these large areas of pristine, quote unquote, ecosystem. And just my own knowledge of history of how seemingly smart interventions have turned out to be extraordinarily stupid from a long-term perspective. And so when I see you talking about smart management, I get this. We've heard this. We've heard this song before. It's not something that has worked out very well in the past, and so I'm really dubious. And what I have seen is that, to go back to your original observation, there has been some talk of connecting this kind of rewilding to Native American spaces. That is its own set of complexities, because what we imagined was like in 1491 doesn't necessarily, it doesn't at all map to what it's like right now. And I'm just, my preference in a lot of these spaces would be to get your fucking hands off of it. Stop,
because what you've seen has been so destructive, and I agree with you that most of what's been done is really destructive. I just want to put a couple things in the conversation. And Doug Tompkins, who died in a kayaking accident but was a co-founder of Patagonia, he and Yves Chouinard bought up a whole bunch of land in South America trying to connect a bunch of ecosystems and parks, which is very likely an inspiration for the paper you shared with us, Shimei. And I like that. I'm interested. For me, what I'm trying to talk about is a knob setting, and the slider at the far right is there should be almost no humans allowed to live on the land. We can have researchers in there to see what's happening. We can have tourists walk through and camp, but they got to clean everything, leave nothing behind, and leave, and not touch anything. The slider all the way on the left is, hey, let's build condos and pave over that parking lot, or make a parking lot where there used to be wilderness. Hugh David Byrne. And I'm saying that the slider should be somewhere with, let very intelligent humans populate the land and help manage it back to better health, and that will accelerate the shift back to goodness. And I'm afraid that the default setting in conservationists and other activists' head is no. Humans have always been shitty on the land. And as counterproof to that, I want to point to the 2 books about Australia that I put in the chat, where when the first fleet arrives in Australia, they walk around, and if you look in their journals, they walk through and they're like, this is like a gentleman's garden. You ride your horse through the forest and you reach up and there's an apple. You look down and there's a gourd. This is a fantastic place. They credit this to nature. They think it's a forest orchard just because it was. They then release their sheep all across the landscape. And it turns out that they're finding archaeologically that there was a ring of like green all around Australia, which is now mostly barren desert. But the Aboriginal tribes had managed to plant spinifex and do this and do that. And there was a ring of fertility all around Australia that the sheep, and I never realized how powerful sheep can be, that the sheep basically ate, because they were just like let go, like, oh my God, look, there's all this stuff we can grow wool. And so Australia becomes this gigantic wool producer because there's lots to eat. And very quickly, the forest orchards turn back into raw thicket wilderness and are not actually useful for what they were. They're still capturing carbon as trees and whatever, but their usefulness as agroforestry or food culture, which is a huge and cool thing, which can help a lot of people live close to nature in a situation that would be less prone to wildfires, God damn it, goes away. So I think all of these things are just really like in play, and we ignore the benefits of smart humans intervening at our great peril. And we cut away a huge wealth of space for people to live in and other sorts of things.
Plenty of space for people to live in. Plenty of space for people to
with water,
live in.
With water at hand? Where?
What I'm saying,
really, no, there's no.
North America is, we're really not very densely populated. We have some density on the East Coast, density in some cities, but in terms of, we have a lot of space, and yes, there's even some space with water. In terms of the Australia story, there's one word I would push back hard on. You said lots of people would be supported by the forest orchards, the food production. I would argue instead that the reason that those food orchards could persist is you didn't have a lot of people. And the same as in North America pre-Euro contact. You had a decent amount of people, a healthy amount of people, not a lot of people. There is
I'm happy to
impact.
Yeah.
There is a massive impact of population pressure in all of these systems.
Totally
agree.
Totally
what we
agree.
need is just a really good pandemic.
Mika,
Oh,
bummer.
I don't. I get it.
Mika, I'm sorry.
You're taking your dystopia too far. And I don't think there's any evidence that suggests kind of that modern industrial agriculture is more, calorie dense than what could be done with a better agriculture system. So I don't think that you could, we're not doing efficient kind of high production nutrition agriculture. That's not what's going on. So I wouldn't rule out the fact that you could farm Australia and support as many people as being supported by Australian agriculture today. In a much more living systems friendly way, right? I mean, I wouldn't use today as the baseline of good product.
A tiny alternate, maybe not great example of what happened, but y'all have heard of the Magna Carta, right? Have you heard of the Charter of the Forest? So at the same time as the Magna Carta was written, there was a companion document called the Charter of the Forest, and it basically said, hey, now that we're starting to sort of fence off and enclose the forest and all that, we are going to preserve a series of rights and easements. So for example, widows are allowed to forage their pigs in the forest for acorns, et cetera, and a series of sort of easements into the king's land, which, you know, is just for hunting deer and whatever else. But they understood that people lived off the land in different ways, sometimes more intelligently, sometimes less. Humanity has a really long and ignoble history of killing itself off by destroying its environments. You know, Easter Island being a nice, like, little isolated example of it. But we are always doing that wrong, so that when we learn how to do it right, to me, that wisdom is precious, absolutely precious, because it's very hard won, right? And then we proceeded to take European, Western, Christian man, destroy all this wisdom across the earth, stamp it out to make sure it never rose again, and still somehow a lot of it survived, thank God, and apply logical Western, eventually scientific, rational, you know, golden rice, et cetera, sort of technology to try to fix the problems, and see where that got us. So Jamie, if you say that mostly when humans have intervened this way, it's ended up in a shit show, I am in complete agreement. I think that's completely right. And I think that it's a minority viewpoint that humans might be good for the landscape, but I'm in that camp. And I want to say, how do we create a really wise core? So years ago, Arthur Brock sent me a video that was on YouTube. I guess YouTube existed, of Paul Crefel, who was this guy in the middle of Northern California who, with a hand trowel, was just taking a video and walking around and repairing the hillsides by following how water flows. And when water flows together too much, it cuts a gully, the gully divides up, et cetera, et cetera. And all he was doing was helping water pool high on the hillsides. And he had, like, photos of 10, 15-year progression in his hills, where he was clearly making a visible difference and improving the hillsides. And then 2 months later, I happened into the videos about the Loess Plateau in China, and how the same principles were being used at a country scale, meaning the Loess Plateau is the size of Belgium, and they healed it. They made it green again from it being a dust bowl that was sending dust over Beijing. So from that time, and then 6 months ago, middle of the pandemic, I get an unsolicited email from Paul Crefel, who says, I've decided to poke my head out a little bit. And so I Googled my own name, and your name is the first thing that showed up. Hi there. And so he's shown up on a couple of OGM calls. He's very peaceful. He teaches, in a school in the middle of California. But I'm thrilled that one of my heroes was kind of attracted to what we're trying to get done. And I'm trying to figure out, part of what OGM wants to do is distill out the wisdom of, hey, follow water, trap water high up on the hillside. That's a pattern language to me of how to manage soil, how to manage water, all those kinds of things. Spread that wisdom to lots of people, and then let's focus on changing tax regimes, zoning regimes, all these other things to actually create healthy systems everywhere. So I would create soil fertility rewards, so that any industrial farmer that is depleting the soil is going to pay a really hefty sum for the depletion of the soil. There's going to be a tax on that. Any farmer who actually adds to the soil organic matter on their land is going to get a bonus, a kickback, a discount, a tax reduction, whatever that might be. Lather, rinse, repeat, right? But we don't have a tax policy like that. We have a farm bill that pays farmers not to farm, or that subsidizes a bunch of crops we don't need, and that does a whole lot of stupid things. And then we bundled, like, SNAP into it for some stupid reason. Maybe so it couldn't be killed, so the other things couldn't be killed. I don't know. It's how the sausage gets made. But for me, all of this is about how do we renegotiate the social contracts to fix the earth while taking better care of humans and the planet. And so for me, those options are all kind of on the table, because I think that humans once knew how to do this pretty well, minus they didn't have computers, they didn't have sensors, they didn't have drones, they didn't have the inner tubes, and now we do. So isn't that cool? And I have little confidence that AI and science is going to solve this all by itself, because that proves not to happen very well. We're about to hit 8 billion. We're just about to cross the 8 billion mark. Yeah, permaculture is a pattern language, or I've seen some efforts to do it that way. I would like to find which ones are really viable, because one of my project goals in OGM is to take a bunch of healthy and interesting pattern languages and make them more available, and then instrument them to make them more useful. and let me explain that for 1 second, because in the context of permaculture, it would play out differently and maybe more powerfully. So there's a pattern language called Liberating Structures, which Nancy White and others helped develop. It's about facilitation of meetings. One of the patterns in that pattern language is called 1, 2, 4, all, which means when you have a big group and a complicated topic, give everybody time by themselves, pair them up, put them in fours, and come back to plenary. That's interesting, and few people have heard about this pattern because it's on some obscure website that doesn't get much traffic. What if there was a Zoom app that was a facilitation chatbot expert that helped you and said, oh, you might want to use 1, 2, 4 all right now, and then said, if you press here, I will set it up for you. I will set up the breakout rooms in Zoom. I will name them. I will put prompts in the chat. I will add a timer. I will basically make it a lightweight task for you, the junior inexperienced facilitator, to run this higher level method called 1, 2, 4 all. So that's what I call instrumenting. It's a terrible word, but taking a pattern and actually making it available and then usable, more usable by doing that. Take that method and apply it now to wisdom about permaculture and to whatever we might learn from sensors and automation and blah, 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 I don't know. But wow, we could go crazy turning wisdom into active betterment for the planet. I'm into that. Like that's what I'm hoping is out there on the horizon to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Sorry for the long riff, but this stuff all fits together. Cool. Kevin, want to say more about what you're doing with the community college system?
Well, I'm just saying that we have one of the larger community college systems. Generally, I think there are 58 campuses in North Carolina, and it's interesting that they do generate, some of their own knowledge, that beyond curriculum. So we're taking all of the paper and getting it digitized, all of the things that are artifacts in the system, and turning it into one knowledge base. All right, so it's being funded by the state. And so the half of what you're discussing, which is we have something, what do we know about that? Oh, well, look, here's all the things that are, that would light up in the system based on, it's automatic, because the machine learning system that's ingesting it was trained on the Dewey Decimal System, right? And so it's got 8,000 of its own, it's created beyond the 0 to 999. It's created 8,000 more categories, all right, that are, in the in-betweens, like the science section, so at any rate, it automatically meta tags this stuff. It does not require human, it reads it and says, okay, here's all the topics, and it creates a hyperdimensional fingerprint of that document, right? So that it can be found and related to other things. So that's half of what you were just discussing. It does not automatically create facilitation, but I think it makes the knowledge in that system much more accessible for facilitated discussions, exploration, research, or curriculum development. That's what I wanted to share. If you want to see it at some point, as it becomes real, let me know.
Thanks, Kevin. Do you know if they're putting this online in some organized fashion?
It will be. I mean, the fact is, it's being paid for by, the state government, and therefore it's, it's going to be a citizen access, right? Capability, right? That everybody will, even if you're not attending community college, you're going to have access to the knowledge base of the state community college system. And that's a pretty interesting, the knowledge in the community college system is some degree less esoteric and more practical in nature.
Absolutely.
And we're
Absolutely.
trying to get, through Heidi, since she's a master gardener, we're trying to get the component of the information that's at North Carolina State included in this, because all of the stuff that they try to put in the hands of farmers and local gardeners and so on and so forth, it would be great to have it accessible this way.
Cool. Love that. Mr. LaForge, you've been freed from your noisemakers
Yes.
nearby. Would you like to jump in and feel free to take us in a different direction?
Sure. I'll go backwards a little bit and then take us in a different direction. But having moved from Atlanta to Colorado, I was commuting up to Boulder to work at that CBD company I used to work at. And I had to get used to the fact that they had these parts of the freeway where you had to be alert to just stop, because the migratory path of the elk and the moose go across it. And they've set up these systems for them to cross the roads. They get the right of way. That's the default thinking here. And they've developed these really clever gateways that keep cattle in, but allow the larger animals to pass through. And it really felt like a nice adaptation of coexisting with each other. So that there are ways that I have noticed that people do that. It does tend to be the larger, more animals that we all love. It's the ones that little kids play with dolls that tend to get that kind of treatment. They found a muskrat that nobody cares about. So, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is, like, Kevin, you were just talking about universities. I've been following Jonathan Haidt's involvement with Heterodox University. And their tagline kind of came to mind earlier when we're all arguing about what's good management, should there be people, human intervention, everything. Their tagline is "Great minds don't always think alike." And I love that. It's a really nice way of thinking, because their mission is to stop this hyper polarization that's going on, and this sensitivity that the younger generation has grown up with. If you've read The Coddling of the American Mind, they're talking about how those who are now young adults have grown up so sheltered that there's this general attitude that their ideas can be violence, which is not true. You can't be hurt by an idea, but you need to be, if you believe that, you need to be protected from those. So you go to campuses and you protest against different speakers who have viewpoints you don't like. The helping to figure out, number one, how do we get more viewpoints into universities? Because most universities now are hyper polarized themselves. If you don't want to go to a liberal college, there are colleges for you. But the problem is we've been sort of self-selecting, the whole Bill Bishop thing, where we've sorted ourselves ideologically, even at the level of our colleges.
Yeah.
So that's
interesting.
one thing.
UNC just adopted a version of the University of Chicago principles, to be, hey, we're not going to have as many safe spaces for the ideas. We'll have safe spaces for, physical, for sure. Right. But, more ability to, bring in, a more higher variety and diversity of ideas. We'll see how well that works out. This is a university that's been around since 1789. All right.
Around here, that's
the only
pretty
reason
old.
it had continuity was, I think it got down to 3 students and 1 professor during the Civil War, and then built back up. Anyway,
it's tough because our general society has gotten to the point now where if you don't like somebody's ideas, you shut them down with ad hominem attacks. You don't argue against them or try to convince them of a different way of thinking.
but that's why you need to be able to teach both symbolic logic and argumentation at a younger age, because you need to be able to recognize what an ad hominem attack is. All right. A lot of people said, oh, we just shifted away from the issue to attacking the other person, and they don't know that the shift has occurred. All right. So we have a little bit of logic blindness, all right, in our, we don't teach it. That's a shame.
Yeah, it's also the ability to move another person too. Is it not a skill that we?
That's
that we
argumentation
teach,
for
and it's
sure.
very
Yeah, that's
nice.
what I mean. The people who learn argumentation, at for practical purposes is if you go to law school, is that, I have to take a position. I'm going to be arguing against the other person for an outcome. There are some sub disciplines like negotiation and so on and so forth, to some degree, management, but argumentation in its pure form, again, you don't get access to something like that until you're in, college, and it should be taught, to the general population, probably in junior high school or early high school. We're not going to get civics back anytime soon, so at least people should be able to, communicate and argue persuasively with each other in a way that they don't resort to an ad hominem attack, right? And they stay with the issues.
Mm-hmm. There's just so much to talk about regaining civil discourse and cancel culture and how that's been weaponized and all those sorts of things. That's another huge one.
Yeah, that is a big one. The Heterodox University, they had a convention here in Colorado, and I actually went ahead and attended it. And it was really refreshing to be around people with such great new thinking. And I put a link in the chat there to a guy from Colorado State University who I went to his workshop there, and I think I'm going to follow up and talk to him. He's probably the Rexiest person I've met in a long, long time. Because what he's doing is he works with wicked problems.
Is this Carcassonne?
Yes, exactly.
Thanks. Sorry, keep going.
So think of something like one of the projects he used an illustration for his deliberative process is how do we allocate water rights in Colorado, which is a huge issue right now. And the thing is, you have very powerful constituencies with very different opinions, and all those opinions are values-based. You can't say that it's not. We need to return the water to the land to maintain nature. We need to support the animals, but we also need to help grow our community and grow industry. And that. So how do you get people with these values-based disagreements to come together? And he's come up with the processes for working through those things. It's definitely something that I wanted to work with. And then just something else I just wanted to share with all of you that I'm not currently employed, but I'm doing some consulting and pro bono work. And one of the clients that I have is trying to say, how do we fix how we take care of children? They don't like to say it, but really they're working with the foster care system. They believe the foster care system needs to be replaced. And this is a huge problem. And I started thinking, wow, this is a great wicked problem, right? How do we fix this? And maybe I can combine those two to get together. But if you look at the latest ruling on abortion, this idea of how we take care of foster children is going to be really, I believe, in the next few years, getting a lot more attention. Because guess what? In a lot of states in America, we're going to have a lot more unwanted kids.
Yep.
Or people born into families that maybe want the children, but don't have the resources to take care of them. So does the state have an obligation to step in with resources because they said, sorry, you got to have this kid, or if they say, no, I don't want this child, where's that child going to go? And who's going to manage the distribution of children in the future? So they have these large, wicked problems. And I'm trying to figure out how are we going to address this? And I'm trying to help this organization say, the time is now for you to start getting a public image. It's Aliyah is the name of the organization. It's pretty small. But it's a very noble ambition because they believe families need to be supported better than they are. That's the crux of what they believe the problem is. But anyway, that's when I think about what I'm doing, the first one you got there, ALIA. But anyway, that's what I'm working on. That's what's in my head these days. And every time I start to think about what it is I want to spend my time on, if I'm doing pro bono work, it tends to be these Rexy kind of things. So I'm back in this conversation.
Sweet. Love that.
Jerry, I've got to go. And everyone, it was great seeing you.
Kevin, thank you.
Take care and have a great month ahead. We'll talk in September.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, if you could direct the conversation toward anything at all in the universe, what would you direct it toward? And you're muted.
I know.
Sky's the limit. Anything at all.
So anything can go.
Mhm.
I went to visit last night an artist in Flanders, a young guy, well, young, 45-ish.
That's very young. Oh my gosh.
That's young. Yeah. His name is Nick Irving. I'm going to show his. So studio
okay.
Nick Irving,
Thanks.
nickirving.com. And so he's doing stuff combination. When you first look at some of his earlier works, you see blobs, which are quite huge sculptures of polystyrene that are 3D printed. So he's designing his sculptures in 3D on in his software, and then sending it to a 3D print shop. But he's on this borderline between, I mean, he's traditionally trained. He's a huge fan of Henry Moore and a couple of other of the British sculpture school. And so a lot of his recent works, if you look at it, you would think, well, they have been generated by code, but they're not. They're not generated by code. They're hand-drawn in 3D as a real artist and then sent to a very advanced 3D printer shop, or he's going back to ceramics, real ceramics.
Ceramics.
So, yeah, where he's really molding or shaping the things with his hands, and then putting them in an oven. And so his studio is it's a real studio, but he's super professional. I'm really very impressed how he's so professional from an artist's point of view, and also from an entrepreneur's point of view. And he's a perfectionist in everything. So he has I mean, I'm going a little bit all over the places, but he's such a huge fan. Maybe I should show it somehow. It's somewhere on his website. There's a couple of things that he has done recently. So, and this is a booklet. You can see that?
Yep.
The
Yep.
museum. So he created his own online museum, which you can find on his website. It's completely self-made, including the space, etc. And he has one of the biggest private collections of Henry Moore art books in the world. So he has something like 310 Henry Moore art books. There's only one organization that has more, and it's the Henry Moore Foundation, which has a couple of thousand. And the other guy that I met recently, I may have mentioned him before. He's doing something that is called the Arena.
This sounds familiar.
And it has a very nice booklet. Very nice folders in it. And so the story is that I mean, he's associated in, I don't know in which way exactly, but he's associated with the INSEAD leadership curricula at Fontainebleau. And so he wants to change education. He doesn't believe in that model anymore. He wants to go back to basics. So basically the one who teaches, or the one who critiques, or the one who has is transferring knowledge is just on a whiteboard or a blackboard with chalk, and a small group of students gathered in an arena, small arena. So he went to a friend architect and he said, can you design for me like a little arena for 25 persons that is transportable? Because instead of sending people all to Fontainebleau, I want to ship the arena to different places in the world. Yeah. And then meet other people there and teach other people there. And the architect said, no, I'm not going to do that. I said, well, why not? Because I first want to understand what is your moonshot dream. And the moonshot dream that they landed on was to build a floating arena that is going to be shown at the Venice Biennale in November this year on the canals of Venice. So why am I saying all these things? It's and so both the artist, he pointed me to a couple of other books about being an artist and doing the work. So I really like the invitation to do the work every day, whether you're in the mood or not, because things happen as you start drawing and sculpting and designing and so on and so on. And associations are made. So, and it's in that sort of mindset that I'm also thinking about the scaffold that I mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, which is a sort of pop-up school or whatever you want to call it, where we invited transdisciplinary nonconformist tribe of people as sort of navigators to provoke, to let things emerge that otherwise would not emerge if you would not do the work. Yeah. So I'm highly inspired by both persons, Nick and Wim over here from the arena, and have his poster in front of me. I mean, he did an amazing thing. He built a cabinet, and I mentioned also in the chat the book of James Bridle. Things are related to each other. So James Bridle has a new book since April, which has a lot to do with what we have discussed in this call. It's called Ways of Being, and it's in essence about non-human intelligences. So the starting point in the book is talking about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is trying to match human intelligence. But his point is that the real good benchmark? Is human intelligence the good benchmark? There are other non-human intelligences that are probably more intelligent than we are. And so also the examples about combining reservation zones and making them larger so that the wolves, I mean, they don't stay within the reservations. they really go all over the places. And so but he's going very far in that, and he brings in the topics of analog computers and about randomness as a way to make decisions. Yeah. So I think the whole thesis in the book, which I just have finished, is that a lot of the choices we have made as humans are, and how we have created computers are to help us make decisions between 2 points.
Mm-hmm.
But analog computers can inform us of other things than just what we have to decide about. So it's a fascinating book, and I think it's the work I'm trying to do. It's about letting emerge, to use Anne Pendleton's words, what is present there, and to create a scaffold for that it becomes possible to emerge. And then do something. But it's about acting as well. It's about what John Hagel calls, it's about instigating and, I don't like the word creating, but instigating and let flourish impact groups in organizations. So that's what's on my mind, taking us in the direction of art.
Mm-hmm. And
other
also like,
sensitivities.
and what is intelligence? And
Mhm.
how should we use our understandings of intelligence to design our future, right? Where the default setting is, oh, human intelligence is the bar, and we should just make things sort of like humans. And one of those quests, which I consider sort of silly, is AGI, sort of artificial general intelligence, or androids that look and act exactly like us, which is like, why are we wasting a whole lot of time doing that?
And for example, in contact with, as part of the advisory team I've put together, there is a young German architect, a young lady from just Stuttgart. She's a VR architect, Andrea Ion Kura, with a really, really very solid philosophical background as well. So the discussions we are having is that VR is not interesting in the context of what I'm trying to do and what she's trying to do. It's not interesting as trying to replicate reality. So to give the example of the Winter Circus that I mentioned before, which is an arena sort, it's very tempting to recreate that in a VR environment and let people run around with their avatars in that sort of thing and just do exactly the same things that they do today in a physical environment. But that's not interesting. So how can you use VR to bring people in an environment where they become aware of other skills and other possible behaviors, and then learn those and come back? Like, I mean, you can easily imagine that you are put in an environment where you are an octopus with 8 arms. So what would you do with 8 arms? And so once you have that knowledge, you come back. James, you're mute.
Thank you. Sorry. You know the term skeuomorph, right? You know, it's basically a physical instantiation. Okay, so you all know what it is. The kind of VR that replicates physical reality is a kind of skeuomorph. It is a way of introducing people to this new technology or this new particular interface with a language, a pattern language that they already recognize, they already understand. I would expect that a lot of people, that quite a few people would find it very confusing and upsetting to find themselves as an octopus with 8 arms in VR, because they've barely wrapped their minds around how do I control myself in VR as myself. And so until that has become normalized, you recognize how this works, the overlapping of VR, virtual reality, and physical reality is a necessary step for a lot of people. I just see it as a skeuomorph. And so I think ultimately you are absolutely correct. Absolutely. But I wouldn't be so quick to disparage the utility of having a mirror world.
Peter, when you were talking about the ceramics, I've been taking a ceramics class, and a lot of what you said really kind of rings true. I was just making a simple statue, and it wasn't going to be anything fancy. It's just a crow. But as I'm making it, the wing fell off, and I'm thinking, oh dear, it's broken. And I thought, my professor's like, it's not broken. It just wants to be a different shape than you want it to be. And so why don't you work with the clay to come up with a compromise? And now I have a statue of a bird with a broken wing. And it's just, really interesting. I did another one where I did a dragon head, and I got into that flow state where I realized hours had gone by, and then I look at what I created and I go, I almost felt like it was something that had just appeared to me at that moment. I don't really remember the creating process for half of what I did. But it's been a real joy doing this. I took another one where I saw a picture of a cubist painting that Picasso did of a pitcher, water pitcher. And I thought, why don't I make that into a 3D product? And it's nothing like what he created. It's nothing like an ambition I had. It just came about. So anyway, the art conversation is very interesting. And then just one note on the work that you were sharing. It's interesting to see what he's doing in the sense that as our technologies emerge, artists are some of the first to figure out what the hell can we do with this? Because his type of art could not have existed long ago. And we do that all the time. It's just, I would love to see a history of what artists have done with different technologies. Some technologies don't change. I would say ceramics is probably the oldest, probably the first things that humans did to create was mold mud. Painting, another one that hasn't changed much, but a lot of this other stuff is, now that we have computer-aided design, what the hell can we do with it? And people are just experimenting, and I love it.
Yeah, there is an initiative, I think from the 50s, that is highly inspirational for me. I think it's called EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. And those guys were involved, by the way, Tom, they were involved by the building of the Coca-Cola pavilion in the 50s. So they were working with artists and engineers and creating, with the latest technologies, all sorts of crazy things. So there's a lot there of what they're doing with that. But what I loved in the book that is, or the information that I found that is describing it, is at a certain moment, they flipped or they changed gears and they said, we are not going to say to the engineers, this is what the artist has dreamed up, and just you build the technology to make it happen. No, they flipped it around and they asked, and I think it's a fantastic question, what do you have? So they asked to the engineers, what do you have? And that is the starting point for the artist to start thinking, what can I do with it? Mm-hmm. So it's just that sort of changing gears and trying to imagine the big future and starting from an empty plate. It's starting from, what do we have? Yeah. That would be interesting in a scaffolding school, to start with that. And ending up with the really fundamental biggest question is, what do you really want? That's a tough one.
That's interesting. It reminds me of a thought I had while we were talking about intelligence, because intelligence is almost a useless term, because my intelligence is completely irrelevant to an octopus's intelligence. It has to do with what are their goals? What is it that they're trying to achieve? What do they need? And different types of intelligences will serve different goals. We as humans,
and so the book of James Bradley is full of those examples that where humans consider certain animals non-intelligent because they cannot basically copy human behavior, but they have other behaviors that we even are not able to notice.
There was this movie Arrival where did anyone see that movie Arrival, where these aliens come and these linguists we had this like global effort to try to communicate with them, because wow, a new life form, a different type of intelligence. And it's just ironic we're not putting that much effort into all the different intelligences that we already coexist with here on this planet.
Absolutely. how little we know about everything.
Yep.
But we think we know lots.
Well, we know enough to manage things, obviously.
Depends what you mean by manage. And management, as I'm conceiving it there, is informed by lots of lessons over time, hard won, by an experimental and curious mindset, meaning, hey, I think this is going to happen, you think this is going to happen. Can we set up an experiment, or can we ask other people who tried and failed, or how can we figure this one out together? And what we're missing is an environment, and I mean like an idea environment and an insight and data and knowledge environment that lets us have that conversation in a very fruitful way.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Definitely.
We don't have that. And what I would love, for example, is the weaving of every speech you've ever given, Jamay, and every post you've ever written and every book you've written or contributed to, with all of the same points you've made connected across the talks, and then connected to other research in those areas with the ability to then dive deeper and go see what's up and what the current state of it is, and then connected to a really lively conversation about that topic right now, which happens to be on Reddit or Stack Overflow or Quora or somewhere else. Like, hey, go, if you want to talk about that right this minute, go over here. And that would be really interesting and I think useful for civilization.
I'll get to work.
Am I asking for too much? Well, a serious piece of my present quest is what would it take to stand that thing up? Because I don't think that's a platform like LinkedIn or Facebook and one platform to rule them all. I think that's terrible. I do think it requires like a Tom Sawyer kind of mind of how do you get everybody to paint the fence, which also requires some idea of defining the paintbrush and the paint and the fence enough that people know what to pick up and do and where to put it. And I'm finding those things pretty challenging. Like next week, I'll be in New York for John Borthwick and BetaWorks are running a Think Camp later in the fall. And as a preview of that, and it's like a mixer for that, we're doing a render session next week in New York. Register, you can, the live stream will be free, etc. So if you want to watch, I can post the link in our chat. But even just defining what are tools for thinking, which is the umbrella for this event. Like, what is a tool for thinking? That's a really hard question to answer accurately, because in principle, whenever you write using a word processor, you're doing some thinking. But for me, a plain word processor is not a tool for thinking, nor is Evernote, which is a multi-page sort of slight power tool for writing down ideas. But if you added a couple features to any of those tools, they start to turn into tools for thinking, right? So Rome Research, Athens, LogSeek, Mem, there's a whole bunch of these tools that look like outliners with rich backlinks. And there's a bunch of people who are on board, on fire about using them to write notes. They're not that much more advanced than Think Tank was back when Dave Weiner wrote it in what, 1985 or something silly like that, right? They don't do that much more than that. It's basically Think Tank plus backlinks. And yet those are tools for thinking. And trying to figure out how to make them all work together is like a fun project.
You don't want a platform, you want an API.
APIs and protocols are core here, absolutely core. And how do you get different tools to play together without falling to their lowest common denominator? So preserving the richness of what each of them brings to the party, because different tools are good at different things.
There is something happening right now that is not directly connected to this, but is an interesting parallel about how do you preserve the richness. Right now, if you are on Android or any other system and you send me a message and up to me on my iPhone, it comes through as a basic SMS. And the SMS, MMS, all very basic, rudimentary. No matter how rich the message was you sent, it only can come through to me. And if you were to send it to a particular other platform, any other platform that doesn't support the Android or an iPhone protocols, it gets stripped down to its bare minimum. Google is trying to push RCS, which is an advanced version of SMS, essentially, that allows for these kinds of encryption and rich messaging and images and all that. Apple is pushing back against that, doesn't want to adopt RCS because it would reduce the advantage it has over Android. The whole point of it is that, or where I'm going with this is the stumbling block to the inclusion of all these diverse, rich presentations is sometimes the profit motive. And so there isn't a technical reason why Apple couldn't add an RCS protocol to iMessage.
Mhm.
It's purely competitive advantage. And so as soon as you said, talking about integrating these different platforms or these different approaches, my immediate thought is, okay, how do you do that without, running headlong into somebody's profit advantage?
And so this immediately takes me back to the stories about how the internet and the web were born in comparison to how things worked in the ITU and the old standards bodies and the ISO. And in the old standards bodies, somebody with a lot of market power would come up and say, oh, I've got a standard. And then there'd be a lot of muscle of the kind you just described applied in those committees. And generally, the standard holder would be trying to wrestle a position of strategic advantage for their own spec, or isolate their own spec from everybody else and compete on, hey, we have the biggest market share or something like that. And the internet was a way to try to avoid doing that by having the IETF and working code, running code, and many eyes or whatever, I've forgotten the phrase, but the methodology for the internet tried to run around those dynamics and worked for a lot of things, and then sort of stalls out in a lot of places because the competitive thing winds up jamming it. So e-commerce kind of stalls out and then goes through. I've watched like a step function in e-commerce where suddenly we had XML. XML was a big leap forward for e-commerce, right? Then we had other sorts of things, and like you can see that things bump up. And so a really important piece here is to try to figure out that dynamic to preserve the healthy competition. The competing standards and exactly. How do you get healthy protocol dynamics? And one of the ways is to do this out of the limelight without a profit motive staring you in the face right away. That is one of the ways.
I got a book.
Yeah,
I mean,
we've run over.
As in, I have to leave. So
You are a book? You
no,
don't
that's it.
look like a book.
I'm not going to go there. All right.
Okay, good.
So it's good, lovely to see you all. I'll see you next month.
Thank you. Same here.
Bye, folks.
We're off. Thanks.
Bye, guys.